How's it going? And I gotta do a very long critique of Marxism. It doesn't matter which version. Fully within a philosophical position that Marxism, regardless of which version, from the least radical, which is just regular Marxism or reformist approach, to post-Marxism or autonomous Marxism, etc. And why Marxism is false. In basic fundamental is it is false, especially in their philosophies, and very especially in dialectical materialism, based on foundation of three principles: over priority a priori, which can be they can ignore empirical evidence despite claiming to be scientific. Not understanding how language works because they're still using obscure language of 19th century, ignoring that we don't that's been debunked ever since, and useless abstraction to the point of idealism, which makes sense because dialectical materialism is an offshoot of dialectical idealism of Hegel. So it's not that far from what we're going with. And Marx and Engels had basically plagiarized and copied many of the ideas of Pierre Joseph Proudhon, the father of anarchism, even though anarchism has been around since the beginning of human civilization, but regardless. And the term scientific socialism was first coined by Proudhon in What is Property 25 years before Marx. And Marx, when he read the Pierre Joseph Proudhon Systems of Economic Contradiction, which was the original Capital, by the way, had make fun of him for using the way he used categories and stuff like that. But Marx, when he used the wrote Capital, he just copied many of the ideas of Proudhon. Categorization, his analysis of capital, use dialectics, etc. The only difference is he add authoritarian hierarchical elements. If we remove that, it's just Proudhonian analysis. If we remove the hierarchical centralized elements. I gave you various samples, but written by many experts throughout the field. And let's start with Ian McCain on Proudhon, on Marx, on methodology. In terms of Marx, well, it just gets worse. The Origin 1847 edition of The Poverty of Philosophy is online now, and it's interesting to note that Marx does not reference many of his quotes by Proudhon. Here's this one quote from the second page of The Philosophy of Poverty. Mr. Proudhon's work is not just a treatise on political economy and ordinary book. It is a Bible, mysteries, secret wrestle from the bosom of God, revelation. It lacks nothing, but its prophets are discussed nowadays more coincidentally than profane writers. The reader must resign himself to going with us through the array and gloomy erosion of Genesis, in order to ascend later with Mr. Proudhon into the ethereal and the fertile realm of super-socialism. Except when you look at the page and line, you discover that Proudhon makes no reference to super-socialism at all. For example, in the System of Economic Contradiction, this mysterious faculty, wholly intuitive, as so to speak, super-social scarcely, or not at all perceivable in persons, but which hovers over humanity like an inspiring genius, is the primordial fact of all psychology. That the term super-socialism is an invention of Marx, and Proudhon never used in System of Economic Contradiction or anywhere else. It did not stop Engels, later proclaiming that Master Proudhon called it in his theory super-socialism. Of course, Engels parodied Marx on Proudhon, becoming the standard for Marxists from then on. So, not off to the best start, but it gets worse. Marx invents a quote and tempers with others. Thus, we read Marx proclaiming, "Certainly, cries Mr. Proudhon, there is one, it is arbitrary, the price which results from this struggle between supply and demand, between utility and estimation, will not be the expression of the internal justice." How assuming mocking Proudhon written on about internal justice, except Proudhon did not write this. It is an invention by Marx. Now this gives the editor of the Marx-Engels collected works a bit of a problem if they sought to reference all the quotes Marx provides. Their solution? Admit that Marx made up a quote? No, they simply changed the text by removing the quotation marks. Also, as I mentioned before, Proudhon used the term twice in the 2 volumes, so hardly a key aspect of this idea, even if we assume Marx gets its usage correct, which is a big ass. Just look at Marx's nonsense of Proudhon's use of the term providence. Now, when we look at page 34, and Marx quote two paragraphs from Proudhon. Say, and the economists after him have observed the labor being himself subject to violation, be a commodity like any other commodity, is moving in a vicious circle to retreat as a principle and determine cause of value. Instead, doing those economists that will allow me to say so. Show me prodigious carelessness. Labor is said to have value not as commodity itself, but in view of the values which is supposed potential to contain. The value of the labor is a figurative expression and a representation of the cause for the effect. It is a fiction of the stamp as the productivity of capital. Labor produced capital has value, but so ellipsis won't speak of value of labor. Labor, like liberty, is a thing vague and indeterminate by nature, but defined qualitative by its objects. That is to say, it becomes a reality by the product. But if there's any need to dwell on this, the moment that the economist read Mr. Proudhon change the name of things, vera revu vocabula, in the true name of things, is implicitly confessing his impotence and proclaiming himself not privy of the cause. Two things. The first paragraph does not come from the same page nor even same chapter as the second. Marx combined without indicating two quotes from the other chapter separated by over 120 pages, and just good measure changed without indicating the second quote. Proudhon actually quote from the System of Economic Contradiction, but what need of insisting? For the moment that the communists changed the names of things, vera rerum vocabula, he technically admits his powerlessness and puts himself out of the question. The question is when the communists change the name of things, and he technically admits his powerlessness, so putting himself out of the question, what does it mean when the communists change the world itself? While this may better suit Marx's purpose in mocking Proudhon, it is hardly honest polemic to do so. Still, perhaps change one word in quote can be considered a step forward compared to making up a quote. Also, I must quote the word of a Marx scholar of his mocking for Proudhon for his analysis of the first quote provide, and I quote from Elliott Oakley's Marx Critique of Political Economy, Intellectual Source and Revolution from 1844 to 1860. Marx made same disparaging remarks about this passage, even though Proudhon here anticipated an idea that Marx was developed as one of the key elements in the concept of labor power, viz. That is a commodity, labor produce nothing, and it exists independently of the prior to the exercise of the potential to produce value except the labor. As the article Proudhon and the Myth of Labor notes showed that Marx in 1847 had no theory of how exploitation happened in production, unlike Proudhon. He spent the next 10 years struggling to get to Proudhon's understanding of the issue, and the process goes from asserting by appeal to Ricardo's authority that Adam Smith and so Proudhon make an error to proclaiming Smith's great merit on the issue of labor command and labor embodied within 10 years. I won't go into detail, but I want to concrete on the methodology, maybe one for later. The section on money which Marx eschews page reference completely. He quotes Proudhon as follows: money is born of sovereign consecration. The sovereign takes possession of gold, silver, and affixes their seal to them. Proudhon does not write this. Indeed, Marx quotes him correctly a few paragraphs previously. And I quote, in the patriarchal period, gold and silver were still bartered and exchanged in ingots, and even they show a visible tendency to become dominant and receive a marked degree of reference. Little by little, sovereigns took possession of them and affixed their seal to them, and to this sovereign consecrate was born money. This is the commodity par excellence. As the Frenchman does not say what Marx wants him to say, he twists Proudhon's word to set him up for mockery, as in so many cases before. Marx's contempt for the reader is striking. He seemed to assume that they would neither consult Proudhon's book nor bother to remember what Marx had proclaimed even a few paragraphs before. And what is the point of Marx is trying to make by this invention? Well, precisely the one Proudhon himself makes and can be seen when Marx writes, and I quote, truly one must be destitute of all historical knowledge not to know what it is to be sovereign, who in all ages have been subject to economic conditions, but they have never dictated laws to them. Legislation, whether political or civil, never does more than proclaim, expressing words that will of economic relations. This explains why Marx distorts Proudhon's argument by misquoting him. Proudhon clearly indicates that gold and silver being used as money predate the sovereign taking possession of them, and as such, the sovereign are reflecting economic conditions and relations. or as Marx put in 1867, the business of coining, like the establishment of standard measure of prices, is an attribute proper to the state. This is from Capital Value 1. And talking of a later revisionism by Marx, because Marx, despite being critical of anarchists and the Civil War in France, he became an accidental pro-anarcho-syndicalist, making pro-anarchist statement and praising the Paris Commune, which was a successful anarchist prediction, not a Marxist one. In 1947, he observed it is a slapping history in the faith to want to begin with the division of labor in general, in order to get subsequently to a specific instrument of production and machinery. A decade later, it was the case that machinery by large arose for the division of labor, which gradually transformed the worker operation to more and more mechanical ones, so that at a certain point in mechanism can be stepped into their place. This is written in the Grundrisse. In 1867, in Capital, repeat Proudhon's scheme of division of labor leading to machinery in Chapter 14, the division of labor and manufacture, and Chapter 15, machinery and large-scale industry. And so to form a cooperation which is based on division of labor assumes its classic shape of manufacture, while the workshop, the production division of labor in manufacture, produces in its turn machines. Then there is Marx accusing Proudhon of holding views he explicitly rejects. For example, Proudhon's view of machinery and the state. With regard to the former, Marx comment on the providential and philanthropic aim that Proudhon discovered in the invention of the first application of machinery, by highlighting the use of machinery by capitalists against workers, and failed to mention that Proudhon himself had drawn attention to this in System Economic Contradiction. For the latter, Marx proclaimed that according to Proudhon, taxation was established with a view to equality and to reveal the proletarian, and fails to note Proudhon concludes that taxation is a new source of pauperism, which aggravates the subversive effect of the preceding antinomies, divisions of labor, machinery, competition, monopoly. He attacks the worker in his liberty and in his conscience, in this body and in his soul, by parasitism, vexations, and frauds, which imprompts the punishment which followed them. Moreover, to conduct this offensive and defensive war against proletarian and public force was indispensable. The executive power grew out of the necessities of civil legislation, administration, and justice. A key area of later conversion by Marx to Proudhon's position is in methodology. As well, I would recommend to read René Bertholt's Proudhon and German Philosophy. There's a free PDF. Marx attack of Proudhon methodology containing the first section of Chapter 2, the metaphysics of political economy. What is interesting, as Pierre indicates, is that Marx mocked Proudhon for his use of abstraction and model building in 1847, only by 1859 to reverse himself completely and embrace what he previously denounced. Note that in 1847, attack was honest. Far from it. Marx somehow forgot to quote Proudhon's many comments of the need to generate abstraction and categories from a study of empirical reality. Here he is commenting on Hegel, and I quote from the System of Economic Contradiction, and we see that this titan philosophy, Hegel, attempts to reverse the internal dualism by dualism himself, to establish identity of contradiction, to draw into being from nothing, and with the aid of the soul logic to explain the prophecy, what should I say, to create nature and man? No other beforehand penetrates so deeply to innermost laws of being, nor had illuminate with so lively a light in the mysteries of reason. He succeeded in giving a formula which, if it is not all of science, nor even all logic, is at least the key to science and logic. But we must glimpse quite quickly that even its author had only been able to construct that logic by constantly mixing his experience and taking from its material. All his formulas allow observation, but never preceded it, and since according to the system of identity of thought and being, there was no longer anything to wait from philosophy. The circle was closed. It was demonstrated once and for all that science without experience is impossible, and that if the self and the non-self are correlates necessary to one another, the inconceivable without the other, they are not identical, that their identity as well as their reduction in an elusive absolute is only a view of our intelligence, a postulate of reason, useful in certain cases for reason, but without the least reality. Finally, that the theory of contrarieties of an incomparable power in order to control our opinions, to discover our errors, and to determine the essential character of the true, is not unique to a form of nature, the sole revelation of experience, and consequently the sole law of mind. Proudhon continually links the need to base any model of empirical reality, yet also reject empiricism because he is aware that what constitutes a fact and what it means in space of a person doing to observe, and so inventively reflects their interest in social position, ideology, etc. As he suggests, facts are not matter, but an invisible manifestation of invisible ideas, so the value of fact is measured by the idea which they represent. Rejecting pure empiricism, he also stated it is impossible to accuse us of spiritualism, idealism, or mysticism, for the idea does not exist, as long as it is not reflected in facts, and so in the operation of the mind analysis and synthesis are essentially inseparable, and theory becomes legitimate only on condition of following experience foot by foot. He stressed that every theory not having a section of experience, that is, of constancy and concatenation, is representation, thereby lacks a scientific character. So, a legitimate theory reflects and explains reality. This is from Systems Economic Contradiction. This is the method he uses, building a model rooted in generalizing from an analysis of reality, but which, because it is a model, so the product of human mental activity must never be confused with reality itself. We must do this, otherwise we are just describing. At best, we can, based on the current conventional wisdom, the history of the world, present the jumble of all facts of which the author is aware. Yet the history of the world is precisely what Marx argues is needed. So in order to discuss anything, we need to discuss everything that has ever happened in relation to it. How could you even begin to start such a project is hard to fathom due to the inherent difficulties involved. How could you develop theory of value and price using such a methodology? Will you have to conclude all the alleged incidents in price formation, which means not only the market conditions for this commodity for all the commodities, not part in the past, this will be, so to say, that it's difficult to achieve? How valid is Marx's point when it comes to his analysis and his critique of Proudhon? Well, let us read Engel's review of Marx's contribution to critique of political economy. Marx is the only one who could undertake the work of extraction from the Hegelian launcher to nucleus containing Hegel's real discovery in this field and establishing the dialectical method. The investor of his idealist wrappings in the simpler form in which become the only correct mode of conceptual evolution, which by the way science has debunked dialectics, the universe doesn't function dialectically, but regardless, even with the determination of the method, the critique of economics could still be arranged in two ways, historically or logically, saying the course of history, as in the literary reflection, the evolution proceeds by a large and simpling to a more complex relation. The historical development of political economy constitutes a natural clue, which the critique could take as a point of departure, and then the economic categories will appear on the whole in the same order as in the logical position. This form seems to have the advantage of great lucidity for the trains of the actual development, but in face it would thus become a most more popular. History moves often in leaps and bounds in a zigzag line, and this will have to be followed throughout. It would mean not only that a considerable amount of material of slight importance will have to be included, but it's also in the train of thought will frequently have to be interrupted. It will, moreover, be impossible to write the history of economy without the bourgeois society, and the task will thus become immense because the absence of all preliminary studies. The logical method of approach was therefore the only suitable one. This, however, is indeed nothing but the historical method, only stripped from the historical form and the very changed occurrences. The point where this history begins must also be the starting point of the train of thought, and further progress will be simply the reflection, in abstract and theoretical consistent form of the historical causes. Though the reflection is correct, it is correctly in accordance with laws provided the actual historical cause, since each factor can be examined in the stage of development where it reached the full maturity is a classical form. Engel, of course, does not discuss how this methodology fits with Marx's proclamation in 1847 that the moment we cause to pursue the historical movement of production relation in which the categories are but a theoretical expression, the moment we want to see these categories no more than ideas, spontaneous thoughts, independent of real relation, we are forced to attribute the origin of these thoughts of the movement of pure reason. He does not, because he cannot. It is a clear rejection of Marx's 1847 position. Marx in 1847 was seriously suggesting that in order to discuss the economic category, it is necessary to discuss its history in all of its detail. This is nonsense, as Marx would later conclude, as one Marxist note, and I'm quoting from Marcelo Musso, History, Production, and the Method, in the 1857 introduction of the Foundational Critique of Political Economy 150 years later. To avoid limits of the economic process to a mere repetition of the stage of what had happened in history, it was necessary to use a process of extraction and therefore category that allowed for the interpretation of society in all of its complexity. For Marx in 1857, it was not necessary to reconstruct the historical genesis of every economic relation in order to understand society, that given an adequate description of it. Musso is work quality and length, and he showed well-known Marx's rejection of his preference methodology in the poverty of philosophy. In days from 1857, Marx here tackles differently the thorny question in the order to assign the economic categories. He had already addressed it in the poverty of philosophy, where in the position of Proudhon's wish to follow not history in accordance with the orders of events, but according with the succession of ideas. He had criticized the idea of construction of the world might be a movement of thought. Thus in 1847, his polemic with the logical dialectical method employed by Proudhon and Hegel, Marx had preferred a rigorously historical sequence, but 10 years later, in the introduction to the Grundrisse, his position changed. He rejected the criteria of chronological succession for the scientific categories. He favored a logical method with historical empirical checks, setting out the categories in a precise logical order, and the working of real history do not coincide with each other. Moreover, as Marx wrote in the manuscript for the third volume of Capital, all science would be superfluous if outward appearance and the essence theoretically coincide. Marx then arrived at his own synthesis by diverging from the empiricism of the early economists, which yield dissolution of concrete element into abstract definitions. From the method of classical economists, which reduce thought about reality to reality itself. From philosophical idealism, including, in Marx's view, Hegel's philosophy, which he accused of giving fruit the capacity to produce the concrete, and finally, from his own conviction in the poverty of philosophy, he was essentially following the march of history. How very true! Marx arrived at his own synthesis by diverging from his own conviction in the poverty of philosophy, that he was essentially following the march of history. But of course, the use of Hegel and category had nothing whatsoever in common with Proudhon's identical use of both. So a Marx's basic complaint in 1847 is that Proudhon did not write the book Marx thought he should. He namely a detailed chronological history of capitalism which discussed all of its aspects simultaneously, though we must note that Marx of 1847 would have concluded the same about capital. Still, this will not stop Marx's proclaiming that Marx was right in both 1847 and 1867, even if both positions are mutually contradictory. There is no need to critique Marx's position in 1847 for his later rejection in favor of Proudhon's use of generalization and abstraction. In terms of the historical movement of production relation, Marx later omitted the following passage from the unpublished introduction in a contribution critique of political economy. It would seem to be the proper thing to start with the real and concrete elements, with the actual preconditions, e.g. to start in the sphere of economy with population, which form the basis and the substrate of the whole social process of production. Closer consideration show, however, that this is wrong. It will be a very vague notion of complex whole, and through closer definition one will arrive analytically and increase simple concepts from a generally concrete terms. One will have to move in more tenuous abstraction until one reaches the most simple definitions. From there, it will be necessary to make the journey again in the positive direction until one arrives once more at the concept, not as a vague notion of a whole, but totality comprising many determinations and relations. The first, of course, is a historical one, taken by political economy as its inception. Economy system will later evolve, which from simple concepts such as labor, division of labor, demand, exchange value, advance to categories like state, international exchange, and world market. Later is obviously the correct scientific method. The concrete concept is concrete because it is synthesis of many definitions that represent the unity of diverse aspects. It appears therefore in reasoning as a sum up, a result that is a starting point, although the real point of origin, thus also the point of origin of perception and imagination. The first procedure attenuates meaningful images to abstract definitions. The second leads from an abstract definition by a way of reasoning to the reproduction of the concrete situation. So, the correct scientific method is to start with a simple concept, such as the use of Brujon's chapter headings, value, and division of labor, to advanced categories like state, international exchange, both of which are discussed by Brujon in appropriately entitled chapters, and not the historical method which Marx argued to pursue in 1847. Moreover, the category provides important criteria for the arrangement of material. It will be expanded and run therefore to express the economic categories successfully, in order to which they have played the dominant role in history. Contrary to their order of succession is determined by their mutual relations in modern bourgeois society. This is why the reverse what appears to be natural to them, in accordance with the sequence of historical development. As Brujon put it in 1846, and as Marx quoted in 1847, and this is from Brujon's System of Economic Contradiction, we're not giving a history according to the order in time, but according to the sequence of ideas. Economic phases or categories are in their manifestations sometimes temporary, sometimes inverted. Economic theories have more or less their logical sequence and their serial relation in the understanding. It is this order that we are flatter ourselves to have discovered. This method of representation in Brujon does not, as Marx proclaimed, think that in reality this was how it happened. He was well aware of the interconnectedness of the categories he was discussed, like, again, quoting from Brujon. In practice, all these things are inseparable and simultaneously, but in the theory they are distinct and consecutive, and property is no more monopoly than the machine is the division of labor. Even though monopoly is almost always and almost necessarily accompanied by property, as division almost always and almost necessarily supposed to use of machines. So much for Marx's claim that Brujon considered economic relations as so many social phases engendering one another, and resulting one from another like antithesis from the thesis, and realizing the logical sequence the impersonal reason of humanity. Marx makes great play on Brujon's idealism and presents the notion that Frenchmen think that the idea of set division of labor came before its appearance in the world. Quote, we shall concede that economists relation view the immutable laws, internal principles, ideal categories existed before active and energetic men did. We shall concede further that these law, principle, and category has since the beginning of time slumbered in the impersonal reason of humanity. Let us step back and consider what Marx is claiming here. Marx is claiming that Brujon thinks that economic relations are immutable, unchanging ideas, and existed before people did. In other words, the value of division of labor, machines, capitalism, and wage workers, competition all existed as categories in their present form. Moreover, before humans existed to exchange, labor built machines, so their labor, etc. In order to question why Marx thought his readers would believe this nonsense, it is useful to consider how did Marx arrive at such an obvious stupid assertion. Let's follow his chain of reasoning, if we can call it that, let's be honest. First, Brujon analyzed the capitalist economy and built a series of categories. Second, a category is a generalization in an abstraction, and so an idea. Third, Brujon is quoted as not giving a history according to the order in time, but according to the sequence of ideas. Economic phases or category are in their manifestation sometimes contemporary, sometimes inverted. Fourth, Marx concludes that when Brujon writes the category and manifestation themselves, the Frenchmen mean that the ideas manifest themselves. It's easy to see how Marx is misled or seek to mislead his readers, for when Brujon writes that categories are in their manifestation sometimes contemporary, sometimes inverted, he is not talking about the abstraction used to build his model or ideals, but rather the actual facts upon which the abstractions are based. Marx reigned today that Brujon suggested that ideas are not manifestation or appear in reality, the facts themselves are, from which we can produce abstraction and categories in response to these empirical facts. Brujon is at pains to stress that his model and its abstraction are rooted in observation, experience. In short, Brujon does not state or imply that because he builds an abstract model based on category that he thinks the model is reality or produce reality by some mysterious process. He simply states that his model helps us make sense of a complex reality. Like Leslie Kolakowski stated, despite Marx's scornful criticism, it is not the case that Brujon regards actual social conditions and economic forces as the embodiment of abstract philosophical categories antecedent to social reality. On the contrary, he is at pains to state the intellectual organization of social reality and abstract categories secondary to reality. Sadly, Khodorkovsky did not speculate why Marx felt the need to suggest Proudhon did hold that particular stupid notion, although as with the quote tampering and invention, it is pretty obvious Proudhon's influence in working-class circle had to be destroyed or any method were fair game. Which leaves us with Marx thought was the correct methodology, rejecting the ability of an abstract model rooted in generalized categories from empirical study. He presented historical materialism that suggested that in order to discuss capitalism, we not only discuss all of its aspects at the same time, but also the history of each of them. No wonder he could not finish his promised book of economics, aka Capital, not until he rejected that methodology in favor of Proudhon's. Marx proclaimed in 1847, economists explain how production takes place in the above-mentioned relation, but what they do not explain is how these relations themselves are produced. That is the historical movement which gave birth to them. Proudhon taking this relation for principal category abstract thought, he immediately put into order these thoughts, which are to be found alphabetically arranged in the end of every treatise on political economy. The economist's material is the active energetic life of man. Proudhon's material is the dogma of economy. So by utilizing the word economists, whom Marx admits studied the life of man, Proudhon proclaimed the dogmas of the economists? What nonsense. Proudhon utilized the material of the economy to show the poverty of bourgeois reality. Its economists and its economists by contrasting their claim by against both reality of capitalism and each other, by noting their contradictory and contradictions, they inversely exposed in capitalism. In short, the same reason Marx quote from the Economist in Capital. This is the core of Marx's complaint against Proudhon. The Frenchman did not write a history of capitalism, a history of its categories and relations. This is a near to impossible task Marx inflicts on Proudhon, should be obvious but not so to him. The burden that his method inflicts on writing is immense, so perhaps it is unsurprising that while Marx had been trying to write a book on capitalism since the mid-1840s, he will not until he embraced Proudhon's methods of using categories to organize it. Marx finally realized in 1857 that this is the correct methodology, a decade after mocking Proudhon for using it. Let us quote Marx in his breakthrough that allowed him to be at last ready to set to work after 50 years of study. The work I have presently concerned with is critique of economic category, or, if you like, a critical expose of the system of the bourgeois economy, is once exposed and by the same token a critique of the system. The whole is divided into 6 books, 1 on capital, 2 on land property, 3 on slave labor, 4 on the slate, 5 international trade, and 6 world markets. It should be pointless to note that Marx's book covered many of the same categories Proudhon addressed in chapters of System of Economic Contradiction, aka the original Capital, and scientifically more accurate than Marx. This use of categories also reflected in Volume 1 of Capital, direct outcome of this breakthrough. Yet in 1847, Marx is proclaiming that Proudhon was a fault for utilizing the work of economists, the category they had drawn from studying the active energetic life of man, instead of presumably Proudhon should have consulted the work of the historian to conduct the historical movement, in short, discard everything at once plus its history. Yet, can we trust bourgeois historian to provide the facts of the historical movement? Probably not. So we had to do original research ourselves on both current society and its history. Presumably we should find to organize a social revolution between our studies in archaeology, history, economics, etc., presumably all funded by our wealthy bourgeois parents of the surplus value exploited by your capitalist friend who is slave slaver, like Engels was a capitalist who owned a factory, need to work for a living, like Proudhon had to do, who had to work for a living, and witness the horrors of capitalism of the first industrial revolution firsthand. It is one of the most annoying aspects of Marxism, the arrogance of an ex-student bourgeois proclaiming himself the voice of wage worker against someone who actually was a wage worker. Hence, the sheer audacity of Marx's comments in labor is a commodity which is a grim reality. Proudhon sees nothing but a grammatical ellipsis to make such a claim to ignore two things. First, the substantial critique of wage labor contained in Proudhon's book, which argued that under capitalism, mechanical progress will have no other effect than to make the chains of serfdom heavier and deeper, the abyss which separates the class that commands and enjoys from the class that obeys and suffers. Second, unlike the bourgeois ex-student Marx, Proudhon had to leave school and become a wage worker in the print company to support his family, and he was an employee when he was writing System Economic Contradiction, aka the original Capital, which is more scientifically accurate. So, as well as we describe the reality of wage labor, analysis how it rose the result in exploitation, Proudhon was, unlike Marx, actually experiencing its grim reality. As Marx once recognized, not only does Proudhon write in the interest of proletarian, he is himself a proletarian, a Horvier. His work is a scientific manifestation of the French proletarian. Being working class does not make you right, of course. When I tried to rewrite history, I proclaimed the printer Proudhon a non-worker. I had I have my differences with Proudhon because I am an anarchist communist. So I'm more in the line of Malatesta, Bookchin, Kropotkin, Goldman, etc. I recognize critique of wage labor and his desire to end it. Even if it's anarcho-communist, I disagree with his Marxist socialism because it's ableist and will create hierarchical power structure, but still keeping some elements of private property and the cost of money. But I digress. Marx's comments suggest an elitism which was in fact the Marxist organization ever says, especially the Stalinists and Maoists. I will talk about Stalinist Russia and Maoist China later, but for now I gotta continue with this one. And of course, there is the irony that Marx later came to St. Crucius Proudhon over the so-called grammatical ellipsis of 1847. And finally, Marx proclaimed that thus the idea these categories are as in little internal as relation they expect are historical and transitional products. Marx later admitted that it is true that the categories of bourgeois economy are valid for all other social formations, contribute to the create a political economy. He continues, the category which expresses relation is an understanding of the structure, therefore provide insight into the structure of the relation of production of all formerly existing social formation, the rules and component elements of which were used in the creation of bourgeois society. Moreover, Proudhon had already addressed it in 1846 in the transcendental nature of capitalism in various aspects. Again, I gotta quote again the system economic contradiction. The question now most disputes the unquestionably that the organization of labor. The socialists go about proclaiming everywhere this novelty all as the world. Organized labor. The economists have replied by maintaining that labor is organized. There is no other organization of labor than liberty to produce and exchange, either of one's own personal account or in association with others, in which the case course to be pursued has been prescribed by the civil and commercial codes. As for us, guided by the idea that we have former social science, which are formed against the socialists, against the economists, not the labor must be organized, nor that it is organized by that it is being organized. Labor, we say, is being organized, that is the process of organization, have been going on from the beginning of the world and will continue till the end. Political economy teaches us the primary elements of the organization. It is the present form. The organization is inadequate and transitionary, and the whole mission of science is continually to ascertain what innovation can be immediately affected. Political economy, mistaking for science, is a scrap of theory, denies the possibility of further progress. Indeed, regardless of what Marx liked to suggest, Proudhon was well aware that economists argued for internal social relations and noted how wrong they were. The error of Malthus, the radical vice of political economy, consists in general terms the affirming as a definite state of transitionary condition, namely the division of society into the partitions and proletarians, and particularly saying that in an organized and consequently interdependent society there may be some who possess labor and consume, while others have neither possession, nor labor, nor bread. So, while say the division of labor has existed in numerous society, it does not imply that its bourgeois form will be any more eternal permanent than those which preceded it. Similarly, while Proudhon linked the rise of wage labor with the workshop of machinery, he does not think that these are internally and permanent fits. Quite the reverse. He argued the worker association can run production so and the hierarchical organization with the production it creates and the contradiction in swap. So to quote Proudhon from 1846, all appropriated wealth must become collective wealth, and the capital taken from the society turns to society. For monopoly is afraid of worldwide proportions, but monopoly which encompasses the world cannot remain exclusive. It must replicate itself or be destroyed. Monopoly being defined as any exclusive exploitation, any appropriation either of land or of the industrial capital or a manufacturing process. As I have indicated before many times, mutualism defined by Proudhon as the synthesis of true ideas of property and community is based on the social ownership of the means of production, free access to resulting in the abolition of wage labor, which workers control production, i.e. the use of workplace and land determining how to use them, at what to produce, when and what quality for specific customers. and from the property is theft. On the universal association, ownership of the land, of the instrument of labor, and social ownership, we want to mines, canal, railways handed over to democratically organized workers' associations. We want these associations to be modeled for agriculture, industry, and trade. The pioneer core of the vast federation of company is society woven into the common cloth of a democratic social republic. As Prohan put it in 1851, Workers' Association furnished the solution to important problems of social economy, of collective forces and of individual labor. As the collective force, which is the product of community case, ceased to be a source of profit to a small number of managers and speculators, it became the property of all the workers, while the division labor can no longer be accused of degradation for the workers. An association will also end the situation where the workers' permanent condition is one of the obedient property, because society being divided into two industrial castes and master wage workers. I note a link between Brujon's free exploitation and his advocacy of worker association. Brujon constantly knows how the economists take to their dogmas as eternal notions or mock them. Thus, political economy, mistaking for science, scrap of theory, denied the possibility of further progress, and that it is putting in permanent rhapsody, so lines of firms, and absolutely valid fact collected by Adam Smith and J.B. said the economists say a few violations of their principle for which they deem to their duty to blame the government are optimists, which regard to accomplished fact, and affirm that the which ought to be is, they are defenders of religion, authority, and other principles contemporary with the conservative of property. The wrong economists have been regarding every accomplished fact and injustice against any proposal or reform. Marx notion that Brujon viewed things as fixed, immutable, eternal category is simply an invention. While his category may exist before, during, and after capitalism, it does not mean they are fixed, immutable, and eternal at all. He says the contrary in many cases. Thus, while Brujon thought mutualism will have competition, he indicated that these will not take the same form as under capitalism. Similarly, while mutual will have division of labor, material and worker, this is not implying that they are exactly the same as under capitalism. This is expected if the workers' currently hierarchical organization, which enrich the few at the expense of the many, is replaced by the organization of labor with worker self-management. In short, the only person who thought categories fixed, immutable, internal were the bourgeois economists, and it will be a Pierre, Karl Marx, who seemed to consider them so unchangeable that they had to be abolished by central planning, although, for example, labor would have to be divided in some way if the system planning was to make sense. And in Capital 2 and 3, Volume 2 and 3, he admitted that it's state capitalism were organized and there's private ownership and the centralized power by the state. So even its most revolutionary conclusions still lead to reactionary conclusions. And even Engels admitted that the state ownership of the means of production is not the solution, and socialism, utopia, and scientific. So Brujon was building an abstract model of capitalism based on analysis, very aspect of system categories in order what he thought helped make understandable. Thus the model of incremental added to make it more realistic and presented based on narrative that suggests each category was spawned by the last one, discussing the model to help us understand capitalism, its dynamic tendency within the point of socialism. It's not reality. Marx knew this and quoted Brujon stating that in the absolute reason all these ideas are equally simple and general. In fact, we obtain knowledge only by sort of scaffolding of our ideas, but the truth itself is independent of these dialectical symbols, free from the combination of our mind. Marx then writes, here all decided by a kind of switch over of which we now know the secret, the metaphysical political economy has become an illusion. Marx quote Brujon explained the method underlying his whole book, namely production abstract theory to explain observation of real events, and proclaimed that he contradicts himself. Classic. Given all this, you can understand the aspirated tone of Brujon's marginal notes in his copy of Marx's book. Equally, you have to share the aspiration to read Marx's later proclamation with a straight face that the salient point of our conception we first outlined in academic, although polemic form, in the book which we aim at Brujon. I think that most people will agree that inventing and tampering with quotes while systematically misrepresenting someone's position hardly counts as academic and polemic. It's not applicable either, as surely we aspire to honest polemic rather than building straw man to thrash to the ground. This is like 19th century Plato. The extra irony is, of course, that the stage Marx was agreeing with Proudhon on the most of thing he was attacking him for in 1847, such as methodology, free exploitation, relation between division labor, machinery. He comes to agree with them at the very end. I could go on as Marx's book is a joke. I can only consider it. But like I said, maybe. Oh god, it is a fucking mess. And while people think Marx would not support reformist idea, he originally promoted ballot boxes, reform, and election like a political party. And well, but couldn't promote. If you do that, you gotta corrupt the party and it become bourgeois revolutionary. They will not promise what they preach, and he was right. But what about labor notes? You know, what's that? How do I explain this? Well, with the Proudhon never had labor mode, the Marx falsely claims, while accusing him of idealist, despite he accused everybody from the utopian socialists as utopian idealists, and Proudhon already called them idealists way before Marx and Engels. So again, he coined scientific socialism and also coined utopian socialists as idealists. So Marx and Engels, you just plagiarized Proudhon a lot. And the biggest example when Marx just copying Proudhon's method came to the same conclusion, of course with the hierarchical authoritarian elements. But if you compare the afterword of the second German edition of Capital, in France and in England, bourgeois had conquered political power. Tense for the class struggle, practically as well as theoretically, took on more and more outspoken, threatening forms. In something the nail of scientific bourgeois economy was thenceforth no longer a question whether this theorem was true, but whether it is useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, political dangerous or not. In place of disinterested inquiries that will hire the prize fighters, in place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and the evil intent of apologetics. Now compare that to system economic contradiction. Formerly, the masters of the science began by putting far away from the every perceivable idea and devote themselves to tracing facts back to general laws without ever altering or concealing them. The researchers of Adam Smith consider the time of their appearance or a marvel of scarcity and lofty reasoning. The economic picture presented by Quesnay, wholly unintelligible as it appears, gives evidence of a profound sentiment of the general synthesis. The introduction to J.B. Say's great treatise dwells exclusively upon the scientific characteristics of political economy, and in every line is to be seen how much the author felt the need of absolute ideas. The economists of the last century certainly did not constitute the science, but they sought this constitute entirely and honestly. How far we are today from these noble thoughts, not do they seek science to defend the interests of dynasty and castle. The more powerless routine becomes, the more stubbornly they adhere to it. They make out the use of most variable names to stamp abnormal phenomena with the quality of density which they lack. They tax accusing facts with heresy. They collimate the tendency of century, and not irritates the economists so much as to pretend to reason with it. And when not only that, because Marxists will accuse the Proudhon and other similar market socialists of the failures of market and falsely accuse them of promoting labor laws, even though Proudhon never promoted that. But when the fall of the Soviet-style socialism, which in reality state capitalism, nowadays they want to promote the development model of socialism based on cooperative exchange via markets. How is it going to Proudhon's approach? Of course, still keeping the hierarchical centralized approach, but still. It's hard to comprehend how Marxists do not realize that Marx, especially his final years, right? We did the writings from, Capital, Value 1 to Critique of the Gotha Program, and Engels writing like on the housing question, are just copy Proudhon's conclusions. If you compare Proudhon's analysis of a case against property, you compare Marx's analysis of the theory of surplus value in capital, it's basically the same conclusion. The echoes are obvious. Regardless, and what about other later writings like their writings on housing? How will their critique? How would the anarchists or anybody who is a Marxist if they would do housing? But there is one simple answer from again Proudhon. From land and housing will be see rental payment being carried over to the account of the purchase of the research, and once the property has been entirely paid off, it shall revert immediately to the commune. In the case of housing, such payments will result in a proportional undivided share in the house the tenant lives in, and all buildings erected for rental and service is inhabitants for citizen. The land and housing will be socialized as a property that paid for shall pass under the control of the communal administration, and for repair, management, and upkeep buildings, as well as field construction. The commune shall deal with the bricklayers company or building worker association. In short, capitalism and landlord exploitation stops everywhere. Wage labor abolished, equal and just exchange guaranteeing. This is self-managed economy. It gives you something in practice or something similar to that in an anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-communist approach. It's from Sam Duckworth, and long before the labor movement got corrupted and the state stepped in, the workers organized a network of cooperative institutions of all kinds: schools, summer camps for children and adults, home for the aged, health and cultural centers, career association, fire, life and health insurance, technical education, housing, and etc. Workers to finance the establishment of the independent cooperative societies of all times will respond adequately to their needs, and such movement will constitute a realistic alternative to the horrendous abuse of the establishment and the fracture of the cause. In this way, the network of a self-managed communal welfare association and cooperative could be built, paid for run by run for the working class people. Such a system will not become plaything of central government financial policy. Such network could be initially built upon and be expelled to struggle both workers and claimants, patients, tenants, and other users of the current welfare state. So multiplicity of mutual aid organizations among claimants chapters within represent the most potent level for change in transforming the welfare state into a genuine welfare society, in turning community care into a caring community. Or another example of the housing question from an anarcho-communist approach in municipal housing. And I quote, "The municipal tenant is trapped in a central dependence or resentment, which is the core reflection of his housing situation. People care about what is theirs, what there can be modified, altered, adapt to change, need, and improve themselves. They must have a direct responsibility for it. The tenant takeover of the municipal estate is one of those obviously sensible ideas which is dormant because of our approach to municipal affairs, still stuck in the close of 19th century paternalism. We argue that the universal education system, turns out to be yet another way in which poor subsidize the rich, which the least of these problems. It is in the nature of public authority to run coarse-eyed and hierarchical institutions for ultimate functions of the perpetual social inequality, and brainwash the young into accepting the particular slot of the organized system. And use this, and we had to start a alternative system based on free association, and use radical education like anarchist pedagogy or the modern school movement in Spain and the United States. Housing association made up of tenants who manage housing and repairs. Resources that are used by association with these societies, such as community-owned schools, workshops, computer networks, and so forth, will be managed on a day-to-day basis by those who use them. This is a base of free association. This is an answer to the housing question that many Marxists fail to realize, or they use outdated views that often lead to capitalist conclusions. And again, with the housing associations, will assist allow inhabitants to manage their local areas, design and maintain their homes and local parks and gardens. Groups they use information to consider important, trying to convince them that errors of other things that improve or harm the conditions around them within the community. They help to improve the social conditions of the area. Unlike the Marxists, when they want to nationalize or force collateralize, it's no different than privatization, and the alternative is socialization of the means of production. What does it mean? Well, straight from the anarchist FAQ, a key aspect of anarchy is the socialization of the means of life. This means that the land, housing, workplace, and so forth become common property, usable by all who need them. This is required because private ownership of collective use property, such as workplace and land, result in a situation where the many had to sell their labor, i.e., liberty, to a few who own it. This creates hierarchical and authoritarian social relations as well as economic classes. So, anarchist society cannot be divided into a possessive and a non-possessive class system that is a condition of social injustice, as well as making a state indispensable to the possessing minority for the protection of the privileged. In other words, as long as land and capital are unappropriated, the workers are free, and that we have a master. The workers are also our slaves. While there are tendencies by state socialists and the right to adequate socialization with nationalization, there are key differences with the different names signify. Nationalization in practice are usually in theory means that our means of life become state property. This means that rather those who need and use to specify the part of the cooperative commonwealth decide that to do with it, the government does, as we discussed, it would just state capitalism, just replacing the current capitalists to the landlords. As Emma Gomez argued, there is a clear difference between socialization and naturalization. Quote, the first requirement of communism, she argued, is the socialization of the land, of the machinery of production and distribution. Socialized land and machinery belongs to the people to be settled upon and used by individuals and groups according to their needs. Nationalization, on the other hand, means that the resource belongs to the state, that is, the government has control of it and may dispose of it according to its wishes and views. She stressed that when things is socialized, every individual has free access to it and may use it without interference from anyone. When the state owns property, such a state of affairs may be called state capitalism. It would be fantastic to consider in any sense communistic. Socialization aims to replace property right by use rights. The key to understand socialization is to remember that it's about free access. In other words, that everyone has the same right to the means of life as everyone else, that no one is exploited or oppressed by those who owns the means of life. In the words of Herbert Reed, the essential principle of anarchism is that mankind has reached a stage of development at which it is possible to abolish all relationship of master-man, capitalist-proletarian, and substitute a relationship of egalitarian cooperation. This picture is based on not only on ethical grounds, but it's also economic grounds. And actually, we already meet the material preconditions for the ultra-egalitarian anarcho-communist style of hunter-gatherer societies of the past called immediate return societies. This implies two things. First, that the means of life are common property without owning class. Secondly, there's a free association between equals within any association, and so industrial democracy or self-management. This has been anarchist position as long as anarchism has been called anarchism. Thus, we find Brinton arguing in 1540 in What is Property. Thus, workplace are the common and undivided property of all those who take part therein, rather than companies of stockholders who plunder the bodies or souls of its wage workers. This means free access to every individual the employee and the association having an undivided share of the property of the company. As the right of fill any position, as all other positions affected by the law subject to the approval of the members. Each member shall participate in the gains and losses of the company appropriate to his or her service. This is from Brinton for the general idea of the revolution. So the means of production are socialized in the mutualism, collectivism, and communism as the rest of the same principle of equal access. When someone joins the existing workers' association, they become full members of the cooperative with the same rights and duties as existing members. In other words, they participate in the decision basis of one person or one vote. How the product of that association are distributed vary in different types of anarchism, but the association that create are rooted in free association of equals. In contrast, of the capitalist society placed on the owner in the dominant position, and new members of workplace or employee and the subordinate members of the organization which they have no say in the matter, and especially in Marxism within the Soviet Union, especially Stalinist Russia and Maoist China, where only the party and the party members had the say, not the people. Socialization will mean the workplace will become a little republic of working men. As economist David Elliott explains, the democratic workplace is a social community, a community of work rather than a community resident. It is a republic of republic of the workplace. The ultimate governance rights are assigned as personal rights to the people who work in the firm. This analysis shows how a firm can be socialized and yet remain private in the sense of not being governed on, and noted that sorry, I almost choked for some reason. The markets are there will be free access to workplace, so workers will not be wage labor employed by bosses. Instead, there will be people seeking association to join, and associations seeking new associate to work with instead of abolishing the employee relationship. Element argued state socialism nationalized it only to democratic firm where the workers are jointly self-employed is a genuine alternative to private or public employment. So, is based on decentralized decision making within the frameworks associated owned by independently run worker self-managed syndicates. The importance of socialization should not be downplayed. This is because of the self-management of work is not sufficient in and of itself to ensure an anarchist society. Under feudalism, the peasants managed their own labor, but such a regime had hardly libertarian for, and a minimum the peasant paid the landlord rent. As industrial equipment can be managed where workers hire workplace and land from capitalists as landlords. This according to Siegfried Hongsheng. Assume the workers are self-employed but do not own all the means of production. In this case, they will still may be powerful owners of factories, offices, and machineries. The owners of the means of production will still receive an income emanating from their ownership. In bargaining with these owners, the workers will be required to concede the claim these owners to an income that will be unable to produce without making use of the means of production owned by others. As the workers still be deprived of surplus, profit will still derive from the ownership of the means of production. This will not be a libertarian socialist or, in more specific case, anarchist communist, as well will still be exploited. It will be capitalism, as there are no wage labor as such, there will be a proletarian. Thus, genuine anarchism requires socialization of the means of life, which ensures free access, no usury. In other words, self-management, while it's an essential part of anarchism, is more sufficient to make a society anarchistic. While socialism, free access to the means of life, it will be yet another class system rooting exploitation. To eliminate all exploitation, social anarchists propose the production access, such as workplace and land owned by society as a whole, run by syndicates and self-employed individuals. Thus, Peter Kropotkin said free workers are on free land, with free machinery and freely use all power given by man by science. This vision of socialization of free access also applied to housing. Kropotkin has similar end in mind, namely in the abolition of rent, but by different means, namely by the expropriation of house during the social revolution. This will be the communalization of houses and rights of the house, namely to the decent dwelling. This is important to note that while anarchists tend to stress communes, this does not imply communal living in the sense of one big family, as Kropotkin, for example, was at pains to stress such continual communal living as repugnant to millions of human beings. The most reserved man and woman certainly feels the necessity of meeting his or her fellows for the pursuit of common work, but it's not for the hours of leisure reserved for the rest and intimacy. Communal living in the sense of human beehive can please some and even at all at a certain period of their life, but the great mass prefer family life of the future, be it understood. They prefer isolated apartments. A communal living together under one roof would be hateful, where it generates rule isolation alternative with time spent in the society and a normal desire of human nature. Thus the aims of the communism, but not monastic or barrack room communism formerly advocated by the state socialists, but in the free communism would place the produce reap or manufacture at the disposal of all, leaving to each the liberty to consume them as it pleased in his or her own home. Needless to say, each household, like each workplace, will under the control of its users, and socialization exists to ensure that remains in the case. The people cannot be tenants like subjects of landlords. So, if the free asset could work, beyond this basic vision of self-management and socialization, the schools of anarchism vary. and depending which school of thought and stuff like that. However, other social anarchists argue that socialism is a little more that they're effective in and of itself will achieve communism. In contrast, within the anarchist communism, society as a whole owns the means of life, which allow for the elimination of both competition for survival and tendency for workers to develop proprietary interests, the enterprise in which they work. As Kokokin argued, there is no reason why the factory should not belong to the community. It's evident how under the capitalist system, the factory of the curse of the village is come to the working children to make the paupers of the male inhabitants. It is quite natural that it should be opposed by all means by the workers, but under a more rational social organization, the factory should find no such obstacle. It will be boon to the village, needless to say, such a workplace based on workers' self-management. The workers ought to be the real manager of the industry. To socialize organized industrial production, to use Gupta's term, will ensure that this is standard living without the problem associated with the market, even non-capitalist one. In other words, the economy is communalized, with land and means of production being turned into common property. It becomes a moneyless society. The community determines the social ecological framework to produce, while the workforce makes the day-to-day decision about what to produce and how to do it. This is because the system is based purely on workplace assembly, effectively disenfranchise those individuals who do not work but live with the effects of production, i.e., ecological disruption. In Maurice Bookchan's word, it ain't be to advance a holistic approach to an ecological oriented economy, which key policy decisions made by citizens in face-to-face assemblies, as citizens not simply as workers, farmers, or professionals. As citizens, they will function as such assembly by their highest level, their human level, rather socially ghettoized beings. They will express their general human interests, not their particular status interests. This communalized economies would join with each other in the regional confederal system. Land, factory, and workshop would be controlled by the popular assembly of the free communities, not by the nation state or by the worker producer, who might well develop a proprietary interest in them. An important difference between the workplace and community assembly is that former can be narrow in focus, while the latter can be given a hearing to the solution that bring out common ground of people. As people rather than workers in the specific workplace and industry, they will be in context of the communal participation for face-to-face voting of the whole community in local neighborhood and confederal assemblies. Whilst will be linked together through voluntary federations, it does not mean the state owns the means of production, as in Stalinism and Maoism does, or social democracy, because there are no state under communist anarchist communism. This means that the workplace of communalized workers' self-management is placed within the broader context of the community, becoming an aspect of community control. This does not mean that the workers do not control what they do or how they do it. Rather, it means that the framework within their work decision is determined by the community. For example, the local community may decide that production should maximize recycling and minimize pollution. A worker informed the decision make investment and production decisions accordingly. In addition, consumer groups and cooperatives can give a voice in the Confederate Congress as syndicates or even in the individual workplace, although it will be up to the local community to decide whether this will be practiced or not. In these ways, consumers will have to say the administration of production and the temporary quality of the product, adding to their voice and interest in the creation as well as the consumption of product. Given the general principles of social ownership and the absence of the state, there is considerable leeway regarding the specific force a collectivization might take. For example, in regard to the mental distribution, the use or non-use of money, as can be seen by the different system worked out in various areas of Spain during the Revolution 1936-39, nevertheless freedom is undermined when some commodities are poor while others are wealthy. There, the mental surplus distribution must ensure that all communities have an adequate share of pool revenues, and resources have high levels of confederation as well as guaranteeing minimum levels of public service and provision to meet basic needs. This is why anarchism has supported the need for syndicate and community to federate. Finally, one key area of disagreement between anarchist schools is how far socialization will go. Well, as an anarchist communist argue that socialization to be consistent must embrace with what is produced as well what produces it. although many that over time the economy will evolve into communism as a legacy of capitalism and scarcity are overcome. For anarchist communism, socialization should be extended to the production of life as labor. This means that whilst having free access to the means of production, people will also have free access to the goods and services produced by them. Again, this is not simply imply people having to share possession they use, where it seems that instead of having to buy the goods in question, they are distributed freely according to need to maintain socialization of the means of production, but not good means based in society, are two absolute opposed principles, two principles that contradict one another continually. The need to go beyond the abolition of wage labor to abolition of money wage system. This is because any attempt to measure a person's contribution to society would be flawed, and more importantly, people differ from one another by the amount of their needs. There is the young unmarried woman and the mother of a family of 5 or 6 children. For the employee of our day, there is no consideration of the needs of each, and the labor check acts the same way. Regardless of precisely which mode distribution precisely individual workplace, communes or area picks, socialization will be underlying all. Free access to the means of production will ensure free individuals, including the freedom to experiment with different anarchist economic systems. Instead of me dunking more about Marxists, especially their Marx and Engels final writings like on housing and their writing on capital, which is copying Proudhon, and how they were wrong for almost everything. Let's talk about dialectical materialism and how, in practice and truth, history has disproved dialectical materialism. I'm not gonna go to extremely detail like how it's been scientifically disproven and how the universe doesn't function dialectically. In fact, according to dialectical materialism, the existence subpart of terminal should not exist, and and when you kick a ball, it's not because of gravity, it's because there is an internal contradiction. It's like inside the ball makes the ball instead of external forces. It's like it's very weird. Like it's like people Marxists don't understand like dialectical material based on very outdated views. How. But let's continue with the Marxist philosophy, right? According to Mao, the Marxist philosophy of theoretical materialism is a true outstanding characterism. One is class nature, openly about dialectical materialism, service of the proletariat. The other is particularly emphasizing dependence of theory and practice. Emphasis the theory is based on practice turns ser practice. Thus, any knowledge of theory is determined not by subjective theories, but by objective results in social practice. Only such practice can be criteria to choose the standpoint of practice. Well, if that's the case, Maoist China was the 11th most violent event in human history, and it is the most violent event when it comes to like leftist ideas. So yeah, like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese famine. Yeah, your model doesn't work. Other than, man, it's like. How do I say this? From this, it could be argued that dialectic has actually been tested in practice, been verified countless times. Then the abstract academic points raised in this point is we're getting like holy shit territories, right? How do I say? How? That the future will always resemble the past in any regard. For they find impossible to prove that the effect of fire and nutritional value of wood will be the same tomorrow as they have been today. It's sure they could find no way to guarantee the regularity of nature. This is how dialectical, in general, not just dialectical material, like dialectical logic in general works. Dialectical materialism, as well as all forms of dialectical philosophy, would be very right to stop appealing to practice proof of truth of their theory, because if we look at their failure success ratio in Marxist September Revolution, they all ended failure, like the Russian Revolution 1905, Ireland from 1916 to 21, the UK from 1919, Hungary from 1919, Italy in 1919, Germany from 1980 to 23, China to 1926, the UK from 1926, Spain to the Republic government time, France from 1936, East Germany from 1953, Hungary from 1956, Poland from 1956, Czechoslovakia from 1968, Yugoslavia shortly after Tito's death, Italy from 1969 to 70, Chile from 1972, Portugal to 1974, Nicaragua to 1979 to 1990, Iran from 1978 to 79, Poland from 1980, Palestine from 1987 to 88, China from 1989, Eastern Europe from 1989 to 90, France from 1968 to 95, Indonesia from 1998 to 99, Serbia from the year 2000. The countless large and small strikes were based on Marxist principle. The stop at the war movement from 2000 to 2017. Scores of rebellion insurgency operating indigenous movements based on Marxist principle, like the Indian Nepalese and the Philippine Maoist insurgency. The Fifth International that never failed. Reformism of the Black Panther Party and the reformist reactionary nature of the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords. The very existence of Stalinism and Maoism. Sectarianism, spread, fragmentations. The Soviet Union, became capitalist. Maoist China became capitalist. Even Mao himself has admitted on state capitalism that China was capitalist. So, Cuba, especially how they treat LGBT and people of color, they never actually nationalize. They have free markets, and they still use the US dollar that creates inequality among the citizens. Vietnam, with partial freedom, they still do not join the means of production. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that we can account for all the setbacks, defeat, catastrophes, screw-ups, tragedy, disasters that have collected plague and labor the socialist movement over the least 150 years. So, and notice the relative massive scale defeat of the Marxist side compared to any other school of thought, especially anarchists. And the reason anarchists won, not because it didn't work, because of extreme oppression from both left and right. Like, for example, Spain, anarchist communist Spain. It was defeated by the combined might of fascist Franco, the Republican government, and Joseph Stalin joining forces to crush the anarchists. So, yeah. So that's all I have to say. Like I said, dialectical philosophy in itself is nonsensical, especially when you go to a scientific realm. You have to reject Big Bang cosmology, thermodynamics, as the basic scientific job in order to subscribe to dialectic, because you assume the universe functions dialectically. By the very existence of quantum entanglement and subatomic goes against the dialectical philosophy, especially Bookchin's philosophy of the interconnectedness of nature. So, yeah. For example, how dialectical materialism is just focusing on. They view dialectical materialism by writings of Marx, Engels, Mao, Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, David Wood, etc. that change is not smooth nor gradual. But there are many things that change in quality smoothly without a single leaf anywhere in sight. Think of melting metal, rock, plastic, etc. In such case, a change in quality from solid to liquid is gradual and not at all sudden. When heated, metal, for instance, gradually softens and slowly becomes liquid / molded. There is no sudden leap from solid to liquid that, according to Engels' belief. Sure, many things do change in least, but many others do not. So the nodal aspect of this law that Engels believes is just nonsense. You know what? I gotta put the link in the description that goes in full detail, because I used to make in my old channel before I got there. I made 6 videos debunking dialectical materialism, so I'm not gonna do that again. So I gotta put a link in the description. So thank you everybody who watched this video. Like, subscribe, share. So see you guys next time. Peace.